Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. Rejoining me on the podcast is Tomas, who is CTO and co-founder at Phoenix Tailings. He's also on the CI advisory board. This is not the first episode we've done with Tomas, so if you missed our previous episodes, we caught up on some of the stuff before, but Tomas is an expert on mining and metallurgy and metallurgical processes, all those other sorts of things. So it's always fascinating to catch up with him. I think it'll be harder and harder to catch up with him in the future because he told me some of this offline. He alludes to some of it on the podcast. He is really, really busy. Companies out there are scrambling to secure access to a lot of these different resources that we're not even really aware of just how much our modern economy depends on small quantities of highly refined and highly pure resources and things like that. So thank you, Tomas, for taking the time. Thank you all for listening. If you have not left us a comment or a review, it takes 2 seconds, really helpful for us, and no skin off of your back. Otherwise, you can email me at jacob@jacobshapiro.com if you want to talk about anything you heard on this podcast, or about the Bespoke Group, or about having me speak at your event, or just anything else you want to talk about. I love getting emails from listeners. So take care of the people that you love. Cheers, and I will see you out there. All right, listeners, you're in for a treat. First of all, we have to thank Tomas, because I think I moved this 2 or 3 times on you, and you're still willing to talk to me. So that's nice. And also, you're probably as busy as just about anybody else that is out there right now with your specific specialty. You're the prettiest girl at the dance. So I appreciate you making some time for us and for the listeners.
Well, it's fun being the belle of all for a little bit, I guess. And thanks for figuring some time out. It's always great to have these conversations.
I think you're going to be the belle of the ball for a while. It's crazy. It's been over a year since our last podcast, and we actually have a lot more listeners than we did before. So some people know who you are, but how about you tell the listeners who don't know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, of course, definitely. So, Tomas Villalon. Day job, I'm a CTO for a startup working on rare earths, specifically the refining of them. So, you pull stuff out of the ground, we take that stuff that comes out of the ground, we refine it into the final metals that go into all of the magnets and all of the applications that rare earths are used for. But yeah, just because of my background, I've worked in iron, done some work with aluminum, done some work with magnesium, and yeah, metals right now are the name of the game given the past, month and a half plus.
How long have you been at it now? Like, when did you start down this path?
I started 10 years ago, if you can believe it or not. During my actually over 10 years ago. Man, I'm dating myself. So when I was an undergrad at University at MIT, I watched Don Sadoway, figured out that, hey, batteries are gonna be a thing one way or the other, and realized I didn't like batteries, but I liked the general principles of them. There was another professor who was working with Sadoway at the time, named Antoine Eleanor, and Boston Metal was starting. So Boston Metal right now is making a ton of iron, making ferroalloys. But yeah, I got to work with them, then do my PhD, got to work with Alcoa, got to work with a company called Infinium, made magnesium, made aluminum, and the rest is history. Now I do the rare earths.
How different is the environment today than it was 10 years ago? Was this like you were sort of a nerd off in the corner, but like people were like, why are you focusing on this? Or was there already beginning to be a groundswell of, actually, we probably should refine some of these things in the United States?
Okay. Depends on who you ask. At the time, there were efforts already underway. So for instance, the Critical Materials Institute out of the US had just formed, actually. It would have been around 2010, because I think this is their 15th year, if I'm not mistaken. So there was already the rumblings. If you spoke to the broader market, though, it's like, why on earth are you doing metals? Unless you were an end user of the products, and if the application was sensitive to you, so, lasers, specialty aircraft alloys, you really didn't think about it too much. Very, very different story now.
Yeah. Why did you decide to get into it? It was just interesting, or was there something more strategic?
Well, for me, it's a little bit more personal. My family's all from Mexico, and I work on ways to make metals in a clean fashion. And I mean, it was really simple for me from the age of 7. You see a giant smog cloud over a city of a couple million people, and you go, well, okay, if we want to have a future, well, what does the future look like besides smog? if you don't fix the smog, you're not going to get anything else. So this one's a little bit more personal for me, and I just find metallurgy fascinating. I found a great group of people to work with. Miles Stapleberg, actually, someone you've had on. He and I met, and instantly we knew we were metallurgists. It's like, okay, we're gonna be friends. So it's a very unique group, but it's a very uh, honest and a very close knit group, shall we say?
Yeah. All right. Well, fast forward to now. Let's see. I pulled up the latest USGS data here. So in 2024, the US was 100% reliant on imports for 12 of the 50 minerals on the list of critical minerals. That was unchanged from 2023.
Mhm.
And the number of critical minerals where we are 50% or more reliant fell from 29 to 28. The one that fell off apparently was nickel, but that was not actually a sign of increased domestic supply chain strength. It was because our industrial consumption of nickel declined to get below 50%.
Yes.
Um, the data up and down, even since the Trump administration really prioritized the rhetoric around critical minerals, like they created this list in the first administration. There was a lot of talk around the types of projects that were going to be set up around then, but it doesn't look like there's been a whole heck of a lot of improvement in where U.S. Reliance on the imports of these critical minerals is that right? Am I being unfair? Is it just that it takes a long time to spin these things up, and that we'll start seeing the fruits of that labor over the next couple of years? Tell me about how the market has changed since the United States during the first Trump administration, at least rhetorically, woke up on this point.
Hmm. Rhetorically, between the first administration and the second one, it's a lot more vocal now. Now there is an end goal. Now there is an end target. In the first administration, it's like, okay, we know it's important, but what do we do? How does this manifest itself? And to an extent, there still is some of that. Like there's a giant pot of money. What do we do with it? How do we allocate it? What helped, ironically enough, was the Biden administration. Because the Biden administration put a focus on a lot of these materials in other capacities. So, for instance, the change to electrification is really strongly driven by a lot of these materials.
Hmm.
And so, as a result of that, the train left the station. Now, with the new rhetoric, it's the same set of issues, but you've got this change into the wording. The end effect is effectively the same,
Hmm.
but the messaging is different.
And how much, like, what does that big pot of money look like? Like, if you're a startup in the metal space like you are, is that like, oh great, like I can like withdraw from this big fund? Is it like, no, I have to submit 20 different applications and then jump through a couple different hoops, and then maybe if I can recite some Shakespeare standing upside down, they'll give me some money? Like, how easy is it to access the money that's been set aside for these goals?
It never is easy. It doesn't matter what administration's in. It doesn't matter who you know, what is going on, unless it is something of absolute critical importance. The pot of money is there, but how you get to the pot of money, that's the big question mark. Obviously, I think you kind of described it fairly well, actually. Is there is a song and a dance, and there's a procedure. There's always a procedure. Um, but being a startup and having the right messaging, I mean, even being a larger company and having the right messaging, and then most importantly, knowing what funding mechanism, who to speak to, and what final deliverable is actually important. Because you can
Hmm.
just say, yeah, let's go make the metal. Okay, the metal in what quantity, the metal in what purity, who's your offtake, what's the buyer structure look like? All of that is super relevant. And candidly, there really hasn't been a push of this style in the federal government's history, probably since World War II, honestly. And so those mechanisms may have existed at one point, but they need to evolve given the completely different ecosystem that we see right now.
That's funny that you say World War II. I would have assumed like that the space race would have been something like this. I would have also assumed that there were special minerals around, like mineral commodities around sending astronauts into space that would have done
Mm.
this. Was it not? Was that as important, or was it really World War II the last time we had this kind of focus?
So what the space race did was it made fancier end products, right? You're building the Saturn V rocket. You need all these fancy alloys. And that is downstream from the actual refining of it. Because when you
Mhm.
actually get into the space, there's getting the stuff out of the ground, there's making the pure metal, and then there's making your end product. That
Mhm.
end product is where the space race really took off. This is where you start seeing your real fancy titanium alloys, your real fancy refractory metal alloys, your molybdenum, your tungstens, that kind of stuff. But a lot of the technology is actually from World War II because you had to figure out how to make it. As dumb as it sounds, Pratt and Whitney's building radial style engines. Well, okay, we need just enough metal so that we can make this design that we know that it already works and it cools it
Mhm.
just enough and it does what we need it to. That's great because the urgency is right there. Space race, on the other hand, is okay, now we need to think so far outside of the box. We've got all of these materials. What do we actually do with them? And you still see traces of that actually, even to this day, depending on what area you're in. So like your semiconductors, for instance, they're still in that how do we do it kind of mentality, as opposed to the how do we make it kind of
Mhm.
mentality.
Interesting. Well, you sort of, there's a list of 50 critical minerals that the U.S. government is worried about. We were chatting just before I hit record. Everybody knows the Chinese on what was it last? Was it last week? Yeah, it was last
Last
Tuesday
week, yep.
from today. So we're recording on February 11th. This will probably come out in a couple of days. They sort of restricted exports on 5 metals. They didn't really like, it's more that you now have to apply for a license in order to export them, which goes back to the same thing they did around germanium and gallium. So theoretically, they will approve these licenses. It's just now they have a lever that they can pull once they know that you have to apply for the license, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, um, but so tungsten, tellurium, bismuth, indium, and I don't know how to pronounce the Mali one. Can you? How do you pronounce that word?
So
Mali.
ironically enough, you accurately said the shortened version. It's molybdenum, but people just call it Molly.
Just call it Mali. All right. Well,
Yeah, yeah.
a different kind of Mali.
Both
Um,
restricted, ironically.
Yeah. Well, and tungsten in particular, there were a couple front page articles that people were freaking out because
Hmm.
China accounts for 80% of the world's output.
Oh
And the
yeah.
countries behind them are Vietnam, Russia, North Korea, Bolivia. Not a lot of US allies on there. So I mean, I guess a two-part question. I wanted to ask you
Hmm.
how you react to that news about China restricting those exports. And then, on that list of 50 critical minerals, you were sort of saying, like, what is the one that is there one that is most critical? Is it just you can't think about it that way? 10 of them are the most critical? Like, what are the
Mm.
ones that we need absolutely the most? That if the trade war between China and the United States was like full bore, like, what is the one that our society would shut down without?
Now, again, these are fantastic questions to be asking. So we'll start by kind of addressing the first one, which was, how does this, how does this have shades of the gallium, germanium, antimony? And candidly, I think it's just that. Um, One interesting take that I heard probably in the past 3, 4 months, about the original export controls, if you will, was that it actually served two purposes. The first was, hey, you know, get ready, guys, this is coming. But the other was, I think I even had a conversation with you about this, figuring out what is actually happening internally. Just because you have all of these numbers, just because you have all of these capacities, doesn't mean that it's properly categorized. So as a result of that, one, you do get to, give everyone fair warning, like, hey, back off, this could be coming. But two, it actually gives you a chance to really dissect what your capabilities actually are. Because once you hit that button on a handful of materials, that's it. It's go time. You got to know exactly what you're capable of. Because if you call the wrong bluff and you realize you have no capacity internally, well, crap, now you're out, a couple of elements that even you yourself need. So that's the first half of it. Um, I also think with this particular five, the similarity is that these are lower quantity materials. Again, almost exclusively held by these countries, but it's a lower quantity. It's something they can control much easier. It's something that they can figure out all of the moving parts relatively easily. I say relatively easily compared to other metals specifically. Um, But when we think about, like, for instance, your tungsten, right? Tungsten's used in a variety of applications. And if I were thinking about putting export bans on it, one area I'd consider is the nuclear space. There are nuclear applications, specifically in fusion, where tungsten, based on most current designs, is absolutely needed. But what people forget is that there's tungsten metal, and then there's tungsten metal for nuclear fusion. And those two are completely different beasts. Tungsten metal, I can get what's called 99.9 3N metal. And that means, functionally, within the metal itself, I still have 1,000 parts per million of impurities in there. But that fusion grade tungsten for something like a tokamak, something that, Miles would probably talk to you about, there's some elements that you got to have below 100 parts per million. Otherwise, that metal's useless. So on the one hand, it's, okay, I got to figure out what I've got. But two, for these future end use applications, and China is energy hungry, anyone can see that. I mean, heck, we're energy hungry. If we want to own that metal, I need to know that I can make it to the quality that I need for this future end application. And then I can hold it back from everyone else as well. So there's a lot of that going in the background. So that answers question one, I hope. Number two, I think, is the more fascinating one. What is being overlooked? And more specifically, why? I mentioned this, I think, in the past podcast, but it never is a question of, at least in my opinion, what is critical. It's a question of why is it critical and where is it critical. I'll give an example. Copper. If you look at the critical materials list, it's not really on there. And for the US, at the very least, we have great copper reserves. Go out to the Western US, fantastic resources. We can work it. Where it gets a little more complicated is on making the copper metal, because you don't pull copper metal out of the ground, you pull out copper ore. We've only got 3 smelters left in the US. Now, so if you need that immediate capacity to make high purity copper wire, copper foil, copper plate, whatever your application is, we really don't have a lot of capacity in the grand scheme of things. From the materials resource perspective, we've got it. From the refining capacity, that's where I would personally look into things a little bit more. And you can see this in the commodities markets as well, because some commodities sometimes will suddenly jump, not because there is a lack of the material as a whole, but because there's a lack of a specific form of it, or the refining capacity somewhere in between has suddenly vanished on a contract. And so, again, copper, Freeport's got a mine, Rio's got mines, these really, really big companies. But actually, the copper metal itself, not really. Okay, so if you don't want the smelters, you either go to Canada or Mexico. Okay, you can still work around that, but I mean, copper is a bulk tonnage material. It's not as bad as iron or aluminum, but it's starting to get logistically really difficult. So whenever I see these critical materials, the question I have to always ask myself is, okay, I understand it's critical, but why? And what can be done to mitigate the risk on a broader scale?
Mm-hmm. Well, and I guess those critical minerals are really, if you're on that list, you're really probably only thinking about it from a quantity perspective, right? Like it's really not getting down as deep into the weeds as from a refining capacity level. From where you sit, like how are you reacting to, this first salvo of protectionism from the Trump administration? Because the countries that the United States imports these things from, like you said, it's Canada, it's Mexico, it's China. Like those are the big 3. There's some others, but like those are the big 3. So how is it, like I would think that from your perspective, watching the protectionist trade war start to take off, I imagine you're looking at it saying like, well, that's got to be a bluff, because if you want any of these critical minerals in any meaningful quantity in this country, like you're going to have to do what Canada and Mexico and China say, right? Or am I overstating it?
That's a really good question. The best way that I can try explaining my logic, and it's a little strange because I haven't fully settled on where this is, but based on the list of materials that I've seen, they're all bulk commodities. And typically your bulk commodities and your critical materials, they don't tend, like if I look at the Venn diagram of the two, they don't tend to meet in the middle very much. And so what I'm trying to figure out is this some economic ploy? Is there, there's always teeth behind something. Okay, well, what are the actual teeth should it actually go down this road? And why these specific materials? Is it an attempt to bolster internal capacity? Is it an attempt to negotiate a better deal? Because frankly, from where I sit, based on the proposed tariffs, I don't see critical materials on that list necessarily. Now, could that be a poker chip being played later? Possible. But the thing about these critical materials, with a couple of exceptions, is their quantities are so small that it's not gonna move things unless there's an actual true export restriction on them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. Which I guess this gets to the economics of all of it, because, and I mean, you obviously know this better than I do, but like if you're in the rare earth space, like rare earths are not rare. Like we have most rare earths, is my understanding. It's just that we don't have the refining capacity, and it's environmentally, or it has been environmentally destructive to refine them. You guys are trying to fix all of that. But like, how quickly would it take for the United States to spin up capacity? Like, if we're talking about small quantities of things, could the United States, refine enough to keep the economy going, or to keep the military going, or satisfy whatever end user is there? Or is it really just the type of thing where, we are dependent? And if it is the former, if it is like, no, it's a small quantity, we have the capacity, how is that economical? Like, one of the ways that China, it seems to me, has taken over this space is they didn't really care about the bottom line. They just did it. And the government was there to support it, and they thought it was strategic. Whereas we just wanted really cheap access to these things, and we didn't want to pollute our environment, like mining them. So like, you're in the startup space here. You obviously think the economics of it are going to play to the United States' benefit. But I could also imagine a world in which everybody has the same idea, and you produce too much of these things. And if we need really small quantities, you completely collapse the market right then and there. And so then, are we talking about a U.S. government, like, funded organization that just creates and refines the materials that it needs, or are we actually talking about a functioning market? So there's a question somewhere in there. I didn't set you up very well on that one, but take that in whatever direction you want.
I think there's three questions baked in there, right? So the first one is definitely, what does the end case look like? One of two ways I see it playing out. One is either group supported to kind of feed internal demand. And the second one, which I see as being more statistically likely over the long term, is a true free market. It'll be difficult to get there, don't get me wrong, because you're dealing with different incentives, different countries have different mindsets, but I do see long-term an open market being available, because the demand for these things is just insane. Even with, potentially lower EV sales, that is only one market they go into. There's a lot more behind them. So that, I think, is kind of the first one. The second one is, this is, I think, the real big one. How quickly can you spin up capacity? For a plant that'll do several thousand tons with the right backing, with the right infrastructure, with the right knowledge base. And that last one is actually, I'd argue, one of the trickiest points, along with the permitting. You can spin something up in 12, 18 months. That's not out of the realm of possibility. Now, that's for several thousand tons. If we're talking several 100,000, if we're talking several million, okay, now we're looking at, and again, if I'm being very aggressive, you're looking at 36, 60 months, because you got to get the engineering done, you got to get the sampling done, you got to get all your supply chains figured out, but it is doable. What that is primarily being driven by at that point, for something that is that aggressive, you either have a need or a demand that forces that project to go that quickly. Because typically, refining projects, mining projects, you're looking at anywhere between 10 and 17 years. It just takes forever, because you've got to get all of that engineering done right. I know a handful of facilities around the world where they didn't do that. They spent a couple $1 billion, and now they can't use a cent of it, because one of the reactors is wrong, or the furnace didn't end up operating the way they thought it. Like, there's a lot that could go wrong. But on the flip side, again, if the need is that high, again, we'll go space race here. When the SR-71 was being developed, um, the U.S. needed to import a lot of titanium. They needed the titanium for alloy development. And, well, the U.S. didn't make a lot of titanium, but the Soviet Union sure did. So they somehow figured out how to procure it, and they were able to sneak it in the U.S. as pizza ovens. Look it up. They apparently titanium alloys work really well in pizza ovens. I don't think they actually do, but that's how they sold it to the public. So yeah, when there's a need that is drastic enough, government, even the private sector, will move fast, but it has to be enough for them to make the decision. And typically for capital projects like this that that have sovereign wealth funds involved, that have huge capex requirements, typically government and private firms will work hand in hand at that point. Either that, or it just becomes a public entity in the case, the nationalization effort. But yeah, can I see it happening? If export restrictions were truly pulled on a couple of materials, yeah. But from what I see right now, it's a lot of talk. Granted, a lot has changed in the past month and a half. Let's give it another month and a half and see what happens.
Well, in your own specific work, are you seeing, is it still more talk, or are you seeing people show up with money to spend and urgent demand and need to get things done as quickly as possible?
I'm beginning to see a lot more of the latter. Still a lot of talk is going around because, again, it went from, okay, get me iron that I need for airplanes, get me aluminum that I need for airplanes, to get me the 50 elements that we've never really produced in large quantities. Well, how do we even get the 50 metals that we've never needed before? So there's a lot of talk on that side. Like, for the next 2 months, I'm basically doing nothing but giving talks once every 2 weeks now. Because people are now aware. Part one. Part two, kind of to your question from earlier, which I think was a fantastic one as well, was, were there seeds planted earlier? Yeah. And the people who planted those seeds now, they're secretly moving in the background as fast as they can. Because if you run out of metals, there's no real substitute, because if you want to build an alternative supply, you either A, have to find another supplier, assuming that capacity exists, or B, you have to find another material, metal, or mechanism. And what? The lithium-ion battery took 50 years? So,
Yeah.
those are the timelines you're dealing with deep tech like that.
Well, but lithium is actually such a great example, because the lithium market has collapsed. The companies that have lithium are doing terrible because there's too much lithium. And I guess the Chinese are part of this as well, which gets to my point about the economics of it. Sure, it's a problem today, but the market is really unforgiving, because you can go back and read the bull case on lithium for the last couple of years from different analyst reports, and it's in the tank. And look at the few companies that are publicly traded that are reliant on lithium, like your Albemarles or your SQMs.
Yeah.
They're in the toilet because there's too much lithium. So I would think that would sort of be a real cautionary tale if you're like, oh, the Chinese have these export licenses they're requiring now on tungsten. Well, okay, if they only produce, what was it? Was it 67 or 76,000 tons? 67,000 tons.
Yeah.
Is what China produced last year. So what happens when, 3 different groups get together and produce 300,000 tons of tungsten for the market? Does it just completely collapse in on itself? How do you think about balancing that demand versus, what the supply is available for?
So the interesting thing about these smaller quantity metals is that, unlike your bulk commodities, they tend to be done with true business-to-business contracts. So whenever a new project goes up for some of these materials, assuming, they're on the public market and trying to commoditize that good, your really high quality tungsten, your really high quality tantalum, your really high quality vanadium, even in some cases, that's done on a business-to-business transaction that never hits the public market. So your really, really smart groups, there's quite a few in Europe, quite a few in South America, quite a few in America that you've never heard of, they approach it much more cautiously, and they let their contractual demand pull their capacity forward. That's the smart way to do it. The other way, as you mentioned, big bang. Just go for capacity, 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 and hope your economies of scale and your process and your ground is good enough to justify it. So to your point, the lithium market, yeah, that went straight up and then it just got oversaturated. For a lot of these more strategic materials, though, again, very small quantities, the number of players that exist is much smaller. So it really comes down to how good is your business development and can you find the application for it? For certain materials, I will tell you that, again, the demand is just nonstop because even within, again, that portfolio of the available quantity, the actual end product is a fraction of that. You have to make it pure, if you will. So,
Mhm.
I mean, real easy one here, your platinum. I mean, there's no shortage of demand for platinum. You can see it when their supply runs out. If there was ever a glut of platinum, sure, it'd go through the market. People would buy it. People would stockpile it. But when some of these materials are only made in a handful of dozen tons a year, that's not a lot of wiggle room, especially if you're dealing with, much more business to business contracts.
Mhm. One of the things that is unique about what you're doing and focusing on, and really some of the things that are driving your ambitions, you mentioned, is to do this in a way that is not dirty or that is not environmentally destructive. What does that look like? Does that look like what your energy source is? Does that look at the actual refining of these different materials? Like how are you becoming sort of cleaner, and how clean have you gotten the process? Is it like relatively clean to how they do it but still not super clean, or is it actually the sort of thing where no, this is like about it, even like the tree hugging greenies would love the way that we're doing things?
Yeah. Uh, so for us, at the very least, we have no scope one, scope two emissions. Basically, what that means is that no direct carbon emissions, no indirect based on the electricity contracts. So that's how far that we go. We're already looking at what's called scope three. So even the sourcing of our own materials to mitigate that impact. In terms of all of the other pollutants, candidly, if I can't breathe the air, drink the water that comes out of the end of the facility, that's not clean enough. Like
Wow.
that, like those are the things that I'm imposing on myself because I mean, think about it. We're in the urban Boston area. You can't do anything without the state of Massachusetts, without, you know, groups knowing what is being done because you got to get everything permitted. And so for us, one of the ways to speed is actually this permitting process. When you have demonstrable proof that, hey, we don't cause, pollution as you understand it. Well, okay, so I'm giving you jobs. I'm giving you new technical knowledge. I'm giving you a facility that then allows for more regional growth in that specific ecosystem while not having the downsides of it. That's a massive thing. And for us, more importantly, from a business perspective, one of the big things that takes mines and refineries so long to get online is just the permitting. So if I can tell someone, hey, there's no carbon dioxide coming out of the end of this plant, I could literally,
Mhm.
take a stack and just breathe the air. Okay, that's a lot easier from a development perspective. So that's kind of how we think about it, and candidly, any product that we take on. Because nowadays, the social license to operate. Are you familiar with that term by any chance?
Yes, but why don't we define it for our listeners?
So obviously there is all of the permitting, there's all of the things that are required to actually get a facility operational, but then there's always people associated with it. And so being able to have a social license to operate then is basically having the people willing to allow that facility or that operation to be there. Great example. There is a copper mine in Arizona, the Resolution Copper Mine, if memory serves me properly. And they've been working on that mine now. It's two major international groups for 10 years. They've sunk several hundred million into the ground. They had all the permits, they had everything ready to go. They even spoke with the Native American groups who have rights to that land. And everything was good to go until it wasn't. And now they're in a legal battle between some of the Native American groups, and the project's just sitting there. They had everything. The economics looked fantastic. They had figured out mitigations for a lot of the typical problems associated with copper mines, but some people just said no. And so if you want to have this clean future, there is no way to get around the massive quantity of metals and materials that we need to produce. That doesn't involve there, candidly, being a refinery right down the street potentially from where you live. There's no way around it. There was an old estimate that I saw. The amount of copper that we need to hit the electrification goals by 2050 that was set up by the Biden administration is twice the amount of copper that we've mined and processed in the entirety of human history.
Yeah.
Again, lofty goal, I understand it, and, noble, but at the same time, it begs the question of, okay, well, we can just dig giant holes in the ground. Fantastic. There's going to be a smelter right down your street that most copper ore is a sulfide, so you're going to have sulfur dioxide coming off of it.
Lovely.
No one's going to buy that. No one. So from a acceptability perspective, from a social license to operate perspective, we have to build these facilities that you are perfectly okay with being right down your street, as far as I'm concerned. If I cannot hit that criteria, then that means the product ain't going anywhere.
Yeah. How much more expensive does that make things?
Oof. So it really depends on the material that you're dealing with. There are some, typically the ones that are in smaller quantities, that you can clean up fairly well. It really comes down to, again, what is your final economy of scale and what are your unit economics? So I'll give you two comparisons right here. So platinum mining, platinum refining. Let's just stick with the refining right now. Platinum is 10, 20 tons a year, so very, very small quantities. And let's be honest with ourselves, the process is a little rowdy. They tend to use chlorine gas. They tend to use some really interesting, really exotic chemistries. But because you're making so little, they can confine everything to the context of the plant, and any wastewater that comes out, unless there's been a major spill or a major issue, it's actually really clean. So if we can envision, I remember reading, I think it was a USGS report, we import 60 tons of arsenic a year. Okay. Same relative order of magnitude. I mean, if I were to build a plant, I'd probably spend a similar amount of money trying to operate that, or trying to build that facility. But operationally, arsenic is a lot harder to deal with. And it is a larger quantity. So in that particular case, my concern, you can always figure out the permitting, you can always engineer it. The question at that point is, can you do it well enough? And is the price point of arsenic high enough for you to justify all of those costs? And if not, you have to look at a completely different technology stack. There's just no way around it, because you're never going to beat the efficiency of an electron or a chemical agent.
Yeah. You mentioned about copper, needing more copper than, we'll have mined out of the earth, like in history, but we'll need double that by 2050. That sounds an awful lot like a constraint on electrification. Like, it doesn't seem like that is possible, and it doesn't seem like we'll meet any sort of electrification goals if that's what we're going to do. I have felt a similar way for a long time about EVs. Like, EVs are part of this glittering future, and yet, I mean, I don't know these things well as you do, but I stopped at cobalt, and I was like, all right, well, there's not enough cobalt, so why am I even like going to some of these others? Does that affect what you think like a clean energy future looks like? Do you look at like a Biden pronouncement like that about electrification? You were diplomatic and called it noble. The other side of noble is that's completely unrealistic. Like, what are you talking about? So I'm just curious from sort of a resource like capacity standpoint, like what is actually realistic for the future versus the pronouncements that have been made in recent years?
So I'm a bit more of a pragmatist in this regard. First off, you always have to have these lofty targets. The only way you're going to get to the moon is if you aim for the stars. Fine, I get it. The more pragmatic side of me says that between the changes in infrastructure, the amount of materials needed, there is a certain number of technical and operational milestones that need to be hit for these very, very lofty goals and targets. And so what I mentally do is I look at these major milestones. So I'll bring up your cobalt. Let's look at copper. I'll throw in a substitute for graphite, and I'll throw in I'm going to use some battery terminology here. I'll throw in a substitute for the electrolyte. So I got 5 big targets. Let's just look at EVs, right? So just purely from a supply side thing, okay, that copper, I don't think we're going to hit that target. It takes 17 years to open up a mine in the US. I'm going to exclude the refining capacity. Okay, that's a lot of copper we got to pull out. You can't Houdini that quantity up. Okay. So now we start talking substitutions. Now we start talking alternative materials. Now we start talking, well, what if we used aluminum instead? Okay. You can engineer around that somewhat. There'll be an effect on the final quality of the product, but you'll still have something. For the remaining materials, okay. I will in a system of 5, I will allow you 1, yes, we're going to figure this out, and I'll allow you 1 Hail Mary. And because statistically, if you put enough smart people behind something, you will come up with a solution. Okay, fine. We found a substitute for cobalt. They've been working on it for 30 years. I'm just going to say, hey, magic happens, and that gets accelerated 10 years. Great. Now we're still stuck with the electrolyte. Now we're still stuck with the graphite. And I can't be bothered to remember the third one right now, if I'm honest with you, but let's stick with the electrolyte and the graphite. Pick one to be your Hail Mary, and it may or may not happen. So now you're looking at a confidence interval of probabilities, and so now you can kind of set expectations for what can be met. And then candidly, you just have to do a triage afterwards. You go, okay, if this is what I'm expecting to get, how do I fill in everything else? Mm-hmm. It's just an issue of supply chains.
Well, I mean, that's a fancy way of saying we're not going to meet all of these glittering goals, right? Because it's just not possible.
I mean, that goal, I'd like to see it met, but the pragmatist in me is saying that there's not enough copper. Okay, do aluminum. Do you still hit all of those metrics? I don't think you're going to hit all of the metrics, but I think you can still hit some. It's a matter of how much drive is there between government, between the private markets, because the economics are going to override everything, and how can innovation, and this is probably the real wild card. My 30-second bit on it. Metals are unsexy. Metals have been done since the dawn of time. There's very little in the way of processing. It's so capex intensive. It's hard to get industry and academia or these research groups to actually work together. If that gets solved, I mean, heck, you could have another Manhattan Project, but you have to have that sheer force of will driving everything. I mean, when the atomic bomb, when Trinity was first tested, I mean, they had just figured out how to make a nuclear pile, I think a decade prior. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's literally an entire new field of science, and they just said, fix the problem. But you need that level of determination behind it.
Yeah. You mentioned aluminum. Any thoughts about the 25% tariffs on aluminum? How does that shake up your world or the market in general?
I mean, it's going to shake up the markets. As for my world, we're too small. That's it. That's the other thing that people forget. A lot of the people, or a lot of the groups that could solve these giant industrial quantity things, mm-hmm. They're not interested in these critical materials. We're so small. We're a rounding error on their revenue in some cases. Think about right. If I think about an aluminum production facility, what they're making anywhere between 200 million and 2 billion a year, depending on how much metal they're putting out. I mean, the rare earths that we would put out, like I said, it's a rounding error. Our tonnage is so small, and that also goes to how things are operated. There's certain materials where you just go, make it, because you need the economies of scale to operate. For critical materials, they're actually really different in that you need to make them, but you need to be sure that you're converting every last ounce of material that's going in. Because when you do a full OpEx analysis, the critical materials, almost all of them, the most expensive line item is the actual recovery and utilization of the critical materials themselves.
Hmm.
So it's a very, very different way of thinking. It's a very, very different way of operating.
Yeah. In the rare earth space, have there been any developments that have been overlooked that you think are particularly important or that change the way that you guys have been acting to things? Because I feel like rare earths, it's so 2010s. Like now we talk about tungsten and graphite and cobalt and all this other stuff. But the OG, I feel like, was rare earths because China cut off rare earths from Japan in I think it was like around 2011.
Yep.
And everybody freaked out about rare earths. And I remember at the time getting, my grandmother calling me up for stock advice, like, hey, do you know any rare earth metal companies that I can buy? Because it was, the front of Barrett's and stuff like that. How's the rare earth space right now?
Honestly, it hasn't changed, at least in my perspective. I think the sense of urgency and the fact that people now know that they need these things, that has changed. But the same ecosystem, the same developmental things, it has progressed, but the mindset hasn't really morphed. Where I see it more, which I find fascinating, is stuff like graphite, is stuff like molybdenum, stuff like tungsten, because rare earths, there's an immediate need now for them. But within the past decade, we've had a lot of technological advances. Again, I'll go back to nuclear fusion because that one's nice and simple. People now know that if they want their magical artificial sun, they need these materials. So now what I'm beginning to see, which is really fascinating, is the foresight of, yes, I want my artificial sun, and now I know because of the material demands, I need X, Y, and Z quantities of these materials. Mm-hmm. That is really what I'm beginning, that's what I've seen in the past 2 months, I should state, that has really led me to, in a sense, question how I look at the critical materials problem from a geopolitical perspective, as well as the alliances that are coming with it. Because up until this point, I would say, with the exception of Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s making the prediction of the rare earths, no other major country or group has moved in such a way that has looked at that 20, 30-year horizon. And now with the technological applications, I mean, even AI, there's critical materials that go into the chipsets that people are unaware of.
Yep.
And I've heard, where do we get hafnium? Where do we get tantalum? Where do we get, and it's this laundry list of like, oh, you need it for your capacitors, you need it for this, you need it for that. Okay, well, if you're consuming a lot of data right now, if you're trying to produce a lot of energy via fusion, whatever your application is, you're having to think about this 10, 20-year horizon and hoping that the technological development path still continues to follow that. Because if it deviates too much, great, now your plans are basically irrelevant. But given the inertia of these industries and given the way in which everything is closing off, it's very much okay, we need this much, I'll choose tantalum for capacitors. We need this much tantalum for all of our chips, or even the quantum chips that you're beginning to hear about now. Like they're trying to get these materials in now and secure these supply chains so that if it works, and that's a big thing as well, because none of these technologies are guaranteed to work. But if it works, I'm ready to flip the switch on and we've got all our problems more or less solved.
Yeah. Speaking to the geopolitics of it, I mean, who are your competitors? Do you have competitors in the United States? Or are you really competing with companies in China? Like who is it that you are finding yourself in comparison with?
I mean, the closest people that we can find ourselves in comparison with is, the mines themselves. So MP Materials, Linus, but we specialize in refining. I'm a metal maker. I can try to dig a hole in the ground, but they can do it much better than me. All due respect to my team, we're chemists, we're processing engineers. If you told me to dig a hole in the ground, I'd grab a shovel and say, here we go. No, they know how to do it professionally. And to that end, you're beginning to see a bit of a shift with certain companies that they're beginning to think in this much more horizontal mindset. And candidly, they have to, because if the ban hammer gets dropped on all of these additional materials, they have to be able to move laterally quickly. The fact of the matter is that, gallium, germanium, antimony were kind of the first shots, but okay, well, let's assume worst case scenario, I call it LIPEC, the lithium version of OPEC from South America decides to band together. Indonesia nationalizes its nickel, which signs were already there. I'll throw in one more and say South Africa nationalizes its PGMs. Okay, well, you have to at least have some capacity that if you as a private entity want to move quickly on this, you have to at least have the mindset or access to the resources that enable you to operate quickly. That's been the biggest change that I've seen. Government is still there. They're still working on figuring out the relationship because it's just a slow process. There's so many stakeholders. It's such a complicated problem. But if you don't have the pieces in line to engage immediately afterwards, you don't even stand a chance from the minute that you say you want to do it.
Does this put you in the strange case of rooting for Indonesian nationalization of nickel and Chinese-U.S. trade war and all these other things? Like, are you built around that, or is your thesis sort of irrespective of where the geopolitical weather is?
Our thesis is irrespective of the geopolitical weather. When we started this company, we made a very unusual decision in that there can be no markups, there can be no subsidies of any kind in our model, because that's never a guarantee. Mm-hmm. And even if it does happen, it can get reversed really quickly for whatever reason. So we designed our company to operate on a free and open market. So that's the way that we're approaching it. We're really, really conservative in a lot of our assumptions when we built this. Again, if it happens and there's upside, great. But I'm never going to plan on that, because in these material and commodity spaces, the luxury of planning on a subsidy or the luxury of planning on a markup on the metal because it's domestic, it's just so uncertain. The mechanism may be there, but you may still not even get it because the mechanism isn't operated properly.
Mm-hmm. I know you've got a hard stop at the top of the hour. What have I not asked you that I should have asked you? Or did I cover it?
You covered the vast majority of it. I think the question that everyone who's listening to this should ask themselves is, what am I not informed about? What is it in my life that there is a material that I don't think about that could just disappear for whatever reason? The fact that we're talking on our laptops, right? There's indium in there. Our cell phones, same thing, indium. When you begin to realize how much our daily lives are affected by just microscopic quantities of these things, it changes the way in which everything is perceived. And candidly, if you're investing in this stuff, or even if you're just looking at the space, knowledge is power. The metal space is big. It's really cloak and daggerish. You have to ask the right people who know the right people. And I personally suspect this is only going to get to be a larger problem, geopolitics aside. Because, with or without electrification, the demands for these materials is just increasing. It may not increase as rapidly, but the next 20 years, I can easily foresee, iron ore resources in certain parts of the world becoming strained. Heck, if you want to go look up something fun, I'm always, besides metals, just look at the materials in the world. Illegal sand mining. It's a huge problem.
Sand mining?
Yeah, illegal sand mining. It's a major, major issue, just because you need concrete. Well, how do you reinforce concrete? You need sand. You need aggregate. So there's major illegal sand mining operations all over the world that you've never heard of. And that's just, one tiny little example. I think last I heard that market's like $3 billion plus. That's just the illegal side of it.
Yeah, we had Will Freeman was on the podcast recently, and I forget the exact percentage, but the percentage of annual global gold production that is illegal like wildcat gold operations was like, he blew my mind. I think it was something like 20% or something like that. It might have even been more. So
Yep.
we think of these things as markets, but it's actually kind of much more manipulated than that. And I mean, to your point, like, demographics cuts the wrong way here. There's 1 billion plus Indian people who all want computers of their own. There's 250 million Indonesians. There's the continent of sub-Saharan Africa. Like, if growth continues on this trajectory, forget about the fancy stuff. Like, even to your point, like even the copper and the iron and things like that, they're not going to be getting it from the United States. Like, they're probably going to be getting it from China or Canada.
It isn't a question of what is the demand going to be. The question is, where is it, and in what form are they going to need it?
All right, well, Tomas, you've been generous with your time, and I know you got to get out of here. So I'm sure we will be talking to you again soon if you can peel yourself away from what you're doing.
Get in line, get on my calendar as soon as you can. I'd be happy to give you updates.
All right, sounds good, man. Thank you so much for listening to the Jacob Shapiro podcast. The show is produced and edited by Jacob Smulian, and it's in many ways the Jacob Show. If you enjoyed today's episode, please don't forget to subscribe, rate, or leave a review. It takes just a couple seconds of your time, but it really helps us. Also share with a friend. If you're interested in learning more about hiring me to speak at your event, or if you want to learn more about wealth management services that I offer through Bespoke or at Cognitive Investments, you can find more information at jacobshapiro.com. You can also write to me directly at jacob@jacobshapiro.com. I'm also on X for now with the handle Jacob Shap. That's Jacob SHAP, no dats, dashes, or anything else, but I'm not hard to find. See you out there.